fix it. So, as Mike so nicely said, I've spent many, many years in this space. I have my own company now, DAC Strategy, which is a marketing consultancy, strategic marketing consultancy. And I do measurement work through that business today. I left full-time agency roles about 3 years ago, and I will never go back, if I'm honest. I have my own company, and I love it. And I also founded in 2017 the Event Marketing Measurement Association. So that's where I'm speaking from today, in a way, because of the real distinct focus on measurement. We just changed the name. So some of you may have heard of EMMC. We've just changed it to EMMA, which I just love to say, so much more than EMMC. So the Event Marketing Measurement Association is a not-for-profit. I make no money from it. So here I am talking about it, but I'm not selling anything. What we're selling is a way of thinking and a standardization approach to measurement that we want the industry to adopt. And that's why I am speaking today and why I do regular speakerships and publish content with the rest of the group about this. If you are interested in learning more, our website is eventmeasurement.org. You're welcome to explore that and join us if you want to in this journey. Our goal is, as the only industry association explicitly focused on measurement, is to establish standards for the industry, to promote and be an advocate for measurement, which is what I'm talking about today, and to provide comprehensive measurement education. We are working right now on a massive 13-module measurement training program, which we're going to launch, I think, in September. So that's something that's very exciting, taking a lot of time, and it's coming. So that's enough about Emma, but I just wanted to give you kind of set the stage of where I'm speaking from today with my measurement hat securely on. So show of hands with those of you who are on camera. Who is measuring their events today? Okay, good. I see some hands. That's lovely. Great. And for those of you who are not measuring your events, why are you not measuring your events? You don't have to answer because I'm going to give you some answers, but that's what I wanted to start with because I often encounter, even as someone who does measurement, a couple of barriers when it comes to measuring events. I know you're going to know the first one, which is the costs. People expect that it's going to cost a lot or cost something, and we know how challenging event budgets can be. And I have noticed on more than one occasion that when people are cutting stuff, measurement goes right out. And so my argument against that is, well, first of all, what's the cost of not measuring? We can talk about that. But I also would say to people, it does not have to be expensive. I think you can do credible and good measurement very inexpensively, and therefore it should justify itself in the budget. We can talk about things later if you want that are budgetary contributors when it comes to measurement. But I think it can be done inexpensively, and it can be done well inexpensively. Now, I sometimes do big measurement projects where you really do a lot of rich data from multiple inputs, and I can talk about some case studies there. But the argument of it's too expensive, I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. I think it should be one that's easy to overcome. And then that cost of not doing it, just a quick story, an anecdote. I was working on a huge technology conference, maybe about 15 years ago. And I was talking to my client about measurement, and she said, we measure by how happy our executives are. She said, if my executives are happy, then we've done a good job. And I was like, are you sure? That doesn't seem like that's a good defense of why you are investing in this event. As it turns out, a new CFO came into the business and looked at the event, said, I don't see the value, and it was gone the next year. So she had no data to defend why that event was a worthwhile investment beyond happy executives, and that just wasn't enough. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say in order to defend your budget, you need to have answers to the big questions. We'll get into those big questions so that when you are asked, if you're an agency side, asked by a client, or if you're in brand side, asked by stakeholders, you have some answers to those sometimes difficult questions and conversations. Another barrier I would say that I hear a lot is simply lack of knowledge. Is people are, I have heard more times than I can mention, there is no way to measure events. And I call BS on that because I do measurement of events. But I also hear that people are scared. They're worried that they don't know how to do it. They don't understand the techniques, the technologies. They don't think that they're mathematicians, which they're often not. They know they're not data scientists. And I think all of that is fine. And is why, again, when we talk about measurement today, what I'm going to go through is not maths. It should not challenge your brain. And it should feel very obvious and straightforward. I see there's something in the chat. Afraid of accountability. So that is another potential one. Like I have heard people say, well, what if it didn't do well? Like what if the results are bad? What do we do there? I actually have another quick anecdote on that. I was working on an event for a large robotics manufacturer. I'm not saying any client names, but you could probably fill in some gaps. Anyway, the agency I was with was doing a number of events for them, and we were measuring those events. And one of the events did not do well. It did not perform well. The results were very negative. And the agency, my team, was really worried about going back to the client with a report of results because we had produced the event and it had not gone well. And we had been like their partner through it. I mean, all the way through, like strategy and content and experiential design and everything. Like we were intimately involved. So we had a problem because the results didn't do well, but we had been very involved in the event. But I insisted that we have an honest conversation about the results and not try to sugarcoat the results. And I won that battle, and we went to the client and gave them the truth, actually. And I'm a big fan of the truth. I find that the truth is enlightening and opens up opportunities rather than closes them. So we gave the client this report, and in the report, we'll get into how to do reporting, but in the report, it wasn't just what happened, here's the data and here's the results. It was also, what do we do to fix it? Because we admit it didn't go well, but we also have identified, let's say, 5 to 6 opportunities to fix it. The client was very pleased, actually. She really appreciated the truthfulness of the reporting and our sense of partnership and shared accountability for their objectives. And in fact, she engaged us to do like 7 or 8 other events off of that. Why? Because she said, you guys know the problem, you know the challenges, you've said, here's how we're going to fix it. Let's go fix it together. So it opened up more opportunity when we had a challenging event. And so that was really an eye-opening experience because it could have easily gone the other way, where the client's like, you guys worked on this with us, you effed it up, we're going to work with someone else. Cool. So metrics are not in themselves bad. They at most do not meet expectations. That's right. And we'll come back to that point, which is a great one. I'm going to keep my chat open so I can see the comments. So is measurement a must? I think it is. I put it into every pitch document, every event strategy that I write, and every proposal that I work on. It does get stripped out sometimes, but I always, always, always fight for it. When I was in agency world, I insisted that by default, we had a line item for measurement in the budget, even if the client did not ask for it. I said, we're going to let them opt out, not opt in to measurement. Partly because as the agency person, I knew that if we were able to do measurement, it opened up a conversation with stakeholders in the business that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. So what I mean by that is, let's say I was working on a trade show stand. In general, the person I would be working with was a trade show manager. That person, in general, was not that fussed about measurement, but their boss was, and their boss's boss was. And so if I were to have a conversation about, let's talk about metrics, KPIs, and targets, they might say, well, you got to talk to my boss. And I would say, yes, I do. Let's talk to the boss. And now I have a relationship with the boss. So it opened a door that I would not have had otherwise without asking questions and trying to get in there with, here's how we should measure. I would also suggest, based on what we're about to go through, that there are some standard metrics and methodologies that should be applied to every single event. And in my measurement work through my agency, I use the same three, the big three measures at every single event activation that I work on, from consumer activations to B2B conferences to employee events, everything. Um, a little different with sampling, but that's a whole nother can of worms that we could get into. So the reasons to measure, you learn, you want to understand how are you doing, what's good, what's not good, what's working, what's not working. That learning element is where you identify problems that you may need to solve. It's where you identify what's working that you can invest in to optimize more. And the quantitative data helps to support that argument. So quantitative data, of course, is large numbers of data that helps to support a recommendation for improvement. I also find, by the way, that when I do measurement, the quant is useful, but the qualitative is also very helpful. So qualitative might be I talked to 5 people who were at the event and got some deep insight from them about their experience. I like to mix those both together because I find that those deeper conversations give me a richer context and insight when I'm trying to make an argument for change. I need both. And I would suggest that we should, as an industry, try to collect both. You want sort of as much large scale data as you can get. You want to construct surveys that are multiple choice so that you can get quantitative data that's very easy for people to respond to, but you also want to do qual. The second reason, as we've just discussed, is validation and proof. So you can tell people, here's why we're investing in this. Now, there is a term I don't use. It has 3 letters. The first letter is R and the last letter is I. I don't use that acronym because that is a financial measure that requires an analysis of long-term post-event behavior. And the challenge with that is that what happens after the event is out of my control. I work with a major automotive brand, which we may have mentioned at the beginning. I do the measurement of all of their auto show activations. What happens at the show is people get really interested in certain vehicles. However, the the manufacturer does not own the sale. It's at the dealership. So it can't be that what happens at the show impacts when somebody walks into a dealership and some slimy salesperson turns them off and they sit and they turn around and walk out of the dealership without buying. That's not the event's fault. That's not the event's fault. And on the flip side, if they walk in and have an incredible experience and end up buying the next level up on the car, that's also not on the event. That happened within the dealership and the touch points there. So what I do when I look at the event is I look at the potential. What potential are we driving back to the business? I'll share this in a little bit more detail in a minute, but that's why I don't use ROI, because it's not a credible measure of long-term behavioral change that happens usually post-event. Unless you're selling stuff at the event and somebody walks in and had no interest in buying until they saw the event and then bought it right then and there, it's very difficult to attribute the sale to the event. But I am a big believer in showing stakeholders proof points. Here's the potential revenue. Here's the potential sales. Here's the potential behavioral change that's coming out of this. And I have found that's enough. They typically understand, like, yes, your job as event people is to deliver, let's say, warm leads to the business or to uplift the brand so the business can take advantage of that. It is not usually the job of the event people to make sure that business is converted. And then, as I said, for the third reason is driving improvement. if we don't analyze in a credible way what worked and what didn't work, it's very difficult to inform future decisions. And what I have found in doing consistent measurement, event over event over event, is that when we implement changes based on the data, the scores go up and up and up. And that ultimately is the goal. And that is also the mission of Emma, which is to say, we want this industry to grow and thrive, and data is the key to unlocking that growth. Because if we understand what's working and not working, it will help the event industry as a whole get better. A question: have you ever used experiential elements that can be ported to the dealership's post-event? Still not quite an ROI data point, but some stickiness. The challenge with this is yes, is the answer. I have done long-term sales attribution analysis. The challenge is that what contributes to the sale is very difficult to parse. And what I mean by that is I'd have to talk to each consumer and try to fish out what drove you to buy this car and what percentage of those experiences drove what percentage of your decision making. I just don't believe that that's scalable. And so I stopped trying. I therefore analyze the potential, and as the event person, I say I'm delivering all this potential value back to the business, but it's not up to me to track what happens afterwards because there's so many different variables and touch points and interactions that can ultimately convert or not convert that sale. Let's see what else we have here. I have ROI to also include any return on the investment, so include social media mentions, other PR hits. So just to comment on that, Mark, which is I'm a purist when it comes to the term ROI. I think of it as financial. What was the investment? What was the financial return on that investment? That's a measurement purist standpoint. I know people use ROI to mean many different types of return. I don't mind if people do that. It's just not what I do because I'm really am a purist when it comes to measurement, and I want to be very clear in the language that I use. And I find return on investment, if you're defining return as it could be social media, it could be PR, it could be advocacy, it could be blah, blah, blah. It's difficult for me to do that consistently and standardize it. Where a financial measure I can standardize because you use the same methodology every single time. You have benchmarks, you understand how you're doing versus benchmarks. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying I don't do it, if that's cool.
Yep,
All
that's
right,
perfect. Thanks for
cool.
explaining.
Thank you. So let's get into some of these fundamental measures. So I mentioned that I try to measure or try to use the same metrics in every single event that I do. And these are aligned to the EMMA standards that we are promoting to the industry. So I'm kind of telling you both sides of the equation, what I do in my day-to-day and also what we're promoting as an industry association. This is an important one and one that often people don't evaluate, which is value to the audience. So the question that we typically put into surveys is how would you rate the value for your time spent at this event? Why is it phrased that way? Because it allows us to universalize the question, meaning everyone wants to get some kind of value out of their experience. How they describe or perceive value is based on their life, their filters, their needs, their wants, but nobody wants to waste their time. Even if when I go on vacation, I sit at the beach, I do not consider that a waste of my time. I think that's a great use of my time. So even if just having a good time is how they perceive value, but the question and the way it's phrased allows you to ask it universally. And I'm a big believer and have evidence to support that when we deliver value to audiences, the brand typically gets value as a result. So there is a correlation between those data points. And that goes to the next one, which is brand uplift. I believe that events are brand builders. We'll get to sales in a moment, but they are brand builders, and we want to shift perceptions about the company, the product, whatever it may be, as a result of the event. And that's true of every type of event, from trade show stands to consumer activations to even employee events. We want people to feel something about the brand coming out of it, even if it's a great place to work. So what we try to do is understand what are we what is the brand uplift that we're trying to achieve? What are the brand attributes that we're trying to get across to the audience? And we ask survey questions, a lot of survey methodology, and we can talk about the pros and cons of that, but we can ask the right kinds of survey questions to understand how did we move the needle on brand. And again, there's corollary data to say when you improve perceptions of the brand, the business sees results. And so that's why brand is a big part of this sort of core metric equation. Post-event behavior. So this goes into that's potentially sales, but it could be other types of outcomes. And that's why this is a universal metric versus a sales metric, because I recognize that there are all kinds of events with different objectives, but there is almost always an intended behavioral change. In a sales standpoint, from a sales standpoint, you might say, we want people to buy more from us. That's a behavioral change. We want people who are prospects to become customers. That's a sales-oriented change. We want people to share their experience on social media. That's a behavioral change. We want people to recommend us to others. That's a behavioral change. So you universalize the metric by looking at what percentage of people are saying, we are going to do the thing that you want us to do. And that's how you get to a standard, by asking questions about and finding out what percentage of people are going to do the things you want them to do. So those are the big three universal metrics that I put into every single project that I work on: value to audience, brand uplift, and post-event behavior. There is a plus one that I do want to mention, although I am getting some pushback on this, particularly with my US clients. And that is societal impact, but in specifically sustainability. And what I also try to put universally into my system of measurement is carbon footprint per attendee and landfill waste per attendee. This is the one that have the most challenges with in measuring, because there isn't a corollary between this and business impact. It is just what I believe is the right thing to do. And I think if we want events to be more sustainable over time, we need to have consistent and credible data to know how we're doing. So I put it in, but it sometimes gets taken out, which is very frustrating for me as someone who cares about this stuff. All right, any questions or comments before I move on to the next section? Cool. Well, keep putting them into the chat if you'd like, and I'll respond as we go. So let's talk about the sales. So how do I look at potential sales? For an event where that is a part of the equation and we're capturing leads, which we often do at business events, sometimes in consumer events as well, I look at the number of qualified leads. I look at the revenue associated with the products that we're showing. I multiply those together and I come up with a potential event revenue. It sounds simple because it is. A qualified lead is someone who can make or influence a purchase decision. The revenue I work on with the client. In the case of the automotive brand, we have an average revenue associated with the cars that are on display. And then we come out with a potential revenue number off of that. And that is a very straightforward way to say, here's the potential pipeline that this event is influencing. And that is how I do it in my day-to-day. That is a very compelling number. And again, it's going back to the business and saying, well, listen, you spent $100,000 on this event. We're delivering you $1 million in potential revenue, an influenced pipeline as a result. That is a very good argument for why they should continue to do the event, because you're showing a potential result, but one that is X times higher than what the investment was. So again, I don't do ROI, but I do projected sales pipeline, and that's how I get around it. Good. So let's get into some of the fundamentals of the how. Because I find often, as I said at the beginning, sometimes there's just a little bit of like, well, I'm not sure quite how to do this. So let me go through some of the techniques that we recommend as Emma and that I use in my practice. It sounds super obvious, but there are oftentimes not the clearest of objectives established at the beginning. And in order to do good measurement, you have to have clear objectives. And sometimes that means sitting down and saying, listen, everyone, we have to hash this out. We have to get to things that we are actually trying to accomplish when it comes to brand, behavior, value to audience, maybe other goals. And you sit down and you map them out. And I find it very helpful when planning the event also because now we know what success looks like. So if I'm going to a creative team, I'll say, here's what success looks like. If I'm working on with event marketing people, here's what success looks like. It gets everyone kind of aligned, and then if you involve the stakeholders at the beginning of this process, when you do the conversation, you can say, well, obviously we need to measure this. We're setting these goals. Now let's measure them. And then when you do the reporting back to them, you say, remember our goals? Here's how we did against those goals. It makes for a very nice linear conversation that you're having with your client or your stakeholders or whomever it may be. Here is just a look at how I articulate goals when I am working on the beginning of a project. And by the way, I do this not just for events, I do it for every project I work on. Establish clear goals, establish a KPI and a target against those goals. So often we stop at goals, but what I find is the KPI, key performance indicator, is the single most important measure of the goal. How are we going to measure this goal? So you've kind of set that up at the beginning. And then ideally, you also say, here's what we hope to achieve. That's the target. So if you say, for example, just in this first one, this is just a mock example. We want to create a perception of the event as a community builder. That's like a brand goal for the event. We're branding the event and we want it to be known as a community builder. We do a difference in surveyed perception scores pre versus post. So just a side note about this. If you have access to your audience before the event, it's amazing to ask them the same brand question before and afterwards, because then you can show a direct lift based on the event. You could say, rate your level of agreement with the statement, X event is all about community. And you say on a 5-point scale, and let's say before the event you get a 4, and after the event you ask it in the post-event survey, exact same question, and you get a 4.3, you've shown uplift. You've uplifted people's perception based on the event. And so here with the 10% uplift is saying, here's what we hope to achieve. And what I have found is the targeting it's a little bit of an guessing game when you first do it, but the more you measure, the more concrete you get with your targets. I have found sometimes in the beginning of a relationship, we kind of guess at what the target should be, and then we're like, all right, next time around, we have some data to work with. We can take a more educated guess next time around because we know what works and what the results were at past events. So this chart is something that I would suggest you consider putting into your event plan and in your communication with your teams, your stakeholders, your creative, whoever it may be, to say, hey, I'm telling you exactly what we're trying to achieve. And it's very helpful. Now, having done that, you have to get the data. And this is where the budget and scope for measurement can scale a huge amount. I would say lowest common denominator is surveys. Find a way to ask people what they think and do so in a way that is easy for them to answer, feels unobtrusive. And I'll come back to a little bit of that in a minute. That is not expensive to do. So you can pretty much do surveys in a very inexpensive way. Now, for the automotive brand that I mentioned, we also have scanners where we're evaluating people's movement through the environment, what they're doing, how long they're spending. We're doing in-person surveys where we're asking people about their experience through interviews within the exhibit itself. We have lead capture data that we're capturing. And so we have And we have observation. So we have someone who's on site at the event, just there to observe from a measurement standpoint. And that goes back to the what I mentioned earlier around the sort of deeper context and qualitative data. I have found that if you have someone who really gets events or understands what we're trying to do, they're just watching. They contribute to the report, their observations, and I find that to be very helpful. So that's mixing that quantitative data with that qualitative data. So getting credible data is used across an array of potential tools. As I mentioned, surveying I find is very important. Behavioral tracking, it's up to you. I find it interesting. It can get expensive. And so I would just be a little careful. The behavioral tracking that I've been experimenting with, it tracks people's mobile devices. So their devices are pinging. They're looking for networks. And so in looking for networks, there are sensors that can capture that and receive that. So it's anonymous data, but it's based on people's mobile devices. And these days, most events, people have mobile devices on them. There are also camera systems that do that behavioral tracking. So there's all kinds of mechanisms. I just would be a little careful about the investment level and if it's worthwhile in terms of the data you hope to get. During event polling, so if you're doing things where, let's say it's a business conference and you have sessions, or you're doing a consumer activation and you have various modules of things you're asking people to engage with, those are good chances and good opportunities in the moment to get a quick snapshot, like, what did you think? And I really like doing that, almost like I do like a rating scale for films, rate this experience 1 to 5 stars. And typically that's very straightforward, very fast in the moment. And what I find is if I do that versus trying to load up the post-event survey with everything that happened, I get much richer data in the moment as the experience has finished versus later. So I really like doing during event polling. It can be done in an event app if you have an app. It can be done in a tablet and sitting, next to the experience. There's all kinds of ways to do it. Let's see, I mentioned observation, social impact tools as looks at things like sustainability and other tools. There's loads of tools out there to help measure sustainability. I make a concerted effort to not endorse specific tools or technologies, but it's very straightforward to find those tools if you're seeking to measure that. And I do think that's a worthwhile thing to do. It does have a cost, but I personally, as a human being, feel it's important. And so I would say take a look at that. Now, at the end of this, you will have captured credible data, and you want to now share that data back with your stakeholders. And you can define stakeholders as you will. That's why it says all here. It could be your clients, it could be your sponsors if you have sponsors of your event, it could be your internal stakeholders if you have people you report up to. It can even be your audience. And so going back to that sustainability one for a minute, if you really want to hold yourself accountable, report your sustainability measures back to the audience of the event. Boy, that forces a different conversation. And I have found that audiences do appreciate that. And so I would consider that. But I would just think about who's your ecosystem of stakeholders and build out reports for them. You may need to customize it by audience, obviously. So what you want to do is report back on here's what happened at the event, here's how it was measured. You want to tell people how it performed against the objectives. So we set the objectives up at the beginning. Here's how we did against those objectives using a mix of quantitative and selected qualitative data. Let me just give you another quick story about this. In the auto show surveys that I've been working on, we're talking about like 10,000 surveys. It's a huge number of surveys coming out of that channel. It's too much to try to extract trends, if you will. So I have put all the quals into AI and said, tell me what everyone's saying. I can find what those trends are, but what I do is I actually skim through all of the responses, all 10,000, and I cherry pick the most interesting insights because the AI is looking at it quantitatively and pulling the highest number of word mentions or phrase mentions. They're not going to know what I know, which is when someone says something very interesting that the brand should pay attention to, I need to highlight that. So I extract those through human intelligence. by reading the responses. It does take some time and finding the ones that I think are most salient or interesting. And I bring those to the forefront in the reporting as this sort of selective qualitative data. I don't try to misrepresent it as here's what everyone said, but here's what two people said I thought was very interesting that we should take a look at. Include recommendations, because that is where actionability comes from, is let's say you're doing an annual event. I can't tell you how much I forget about what happened a year ago. I do, I forget it. I barely remember the event that happened a year ago. But if I go back to the report, I'm like, oh yes, here's what we did. Here's how we evaluated it. Here's what we said we should do differently. And then in planning the next year's event, I was like, okay, what can we bring in from last year's reporting to do differently next time? And that drives this continuous improvement cycle. And that again is another defense for why measuring events is so important, is to say we are trying to deliver greater and better impact over time. If you have sponsors, this is maybe a niche for you guys, but if you have sponsors, it is relevant to have certain data points for them because they're investing, like an audience is investing its time, and sometimes it's money. Sponsors are investing their time and money, and you need to show them the value of their sponsorship and their participation. And I think that is incumbent on the organizer of the event to show the value to the sponsors. They may do their own like lead capture, that's fine, but you want to show them why this event was worthwhile investment for them. And then, as I said, for attendees, you may also want to open up some data points for them. Especially interesting, by the way, if you're doing an event where people come year after year, is if you can say to them, we heard you. We heard last year you told us X, Y, and Z, and here's what we're doing differently this time. That's a lovely way to encourage people to complete surveys because they're actually being heard and changes are being implemented based on what they're saying. So that's just another tip. When you do reporting, it's very important, I find, to visualize data. I work with a data analyst because I'm not the best at coming up with data visualizations, and he does a great job of turning my data into charts and graphs. And those charts and graphs are great ways to show people what the results were and the performance was of the event. Add observation to explain the results. So you're contextualizing what you're seeing in the charts. You have the chart, and then you say, oh, very interesting. Here we see blah, blah, blah. Like here we see this, and here's why we think that is. Very useful. And as an event person, I often will say to marketing teams, like, I did a project with a giant technology company, and everyone that works at this company was extremely smart, but they didn't know crap about events. And I was not afraid to say to them, I am the event expert. So let me tell you what worked and didn't work with this event. Because even though you're brilliant, this is my world and you're stepping into my space. And I think that's very empowering for event people to own it. Own your expertise and don't be afraid to speak credibly about what you're seeing and offer recommendations based on that. If you can compare your results pre versus post or compare to a benchmark, that's very useful. I don't remember how much time I have. Am I running out of time?
You're running way over, but this is catnip, to
All
tell you
right,
the truth,
I'm
Dax.
going to
So
wrap it up. I'm going
we've
to
got
wrap it
no,
up.
we've got half an hour after this, and I think we'll split it between QA, and then we will go to a breakout room where we
Okay,
can discuss those things.
sorry.
So
Yeah, my bad.
yeah,
I
no, it's good, it's
I
fine.
just looked at the time and I get so excited about this. All right, so I am almost done. So let me just wrap things up here. So a benchmark is really important. So if my daughters come home from school and they got a B on a test, if everyone else in the class got an A, that's not that great. If everyone else got a C, then the B is pretty good. That's that's why I need to have comparative data points. I need to know what happened last year, what the score was, what happened with the people that didn't come to the event, and compare it so that I know what good looks like. Because otherwise, it's just numbers, and I need comparisons to do that. If you do this enough, you develop your own benchmarks. We have event benchmarks for what does value look like. We have event benchmarks for behavioral change. including improvement recommendations, as I mentioned, and then really have a discussion with stakeholders so that you keep them involved in this conversation about measurement. And I think you will find that they will